Every picture you have ever seen of a harem is a lie, not an exaggeration, not a slight distortion, a deliberate, carefully constructed fiction, built by men who had never set foot inside one, painted by artists who were working from pure imagination, and sold to the Western world as documented truth. The silks draped over half-naked bodies, the fountains, the languid women waiting on cushions, doing nothing, existing only for the pleasure of a single man. You have seen that image in movies, in museum paintings, in the opening scenes of a dozen Hollywood productions. It feels ancient and authoritative, the way myths always do when they have been repeated long enough. Women ran governments. Slave girls became the most powerful political operators in the known world. A Ukrainian farmer's daughter rewrote 200 years of Ottoman constitutional law without holding a single official title. Foreign ambassadors bribed their way into the harem's inner circle, not for entertainment, but because that was where the real decisions got made. Russian diplomatic dispatches sent to Constantinople in the 18th century were addressed not to the Sultan's ministers, but to the Sultan's mother, because the diplomats who survived long enough in that posting understood something their successors kept having to relearn. The woman behind the curtain was more valuable to negotiate with than the man on the throne. This is the story of one of the most misunderstood institutions in human history, and the reason it matters right now, today, watching this from wherever you are, is that the lie told about the harem is still running. It shaped how the West sees the Middle East. It shaped how Hollywood builds its villains and its exotic backdrops. It shaped what gets taught and what gets left out. The fantasy that replaced the reality was not an accident. It was a tool, and once you see what the tool was built to do, you cannot unsee it. If you are watching this for the first time, hit subscribe right now, because we do this kind of thing here. We take the stories that got buried under centuries of propaganda and we pull them back into the light. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you are watching from. I want to know if you are in Istanbul, or Indiana, in Tehran, or Texas. The conversation in the comments on videos like this one gets genuinely wild. And now, let us go inside. The word itself is the first clue that something got lost in translation. Harem. In Arabic, the root is haram, which does not mean pleasure palace. It does not mean brothel. It means forbidden, sacred, protected, off limits. It is the same root as the word for sanctuary, the same root used for the holy precincts of Mecca. When you walked into the harem of a great house, you were not walking into a den of indulgence. You were walking into the most guarded, most legally protected, most seriously defended space in the entire compound. The women inside were not decoration. They were the reason the walls existed. That distinction died somewhere in the early 18th century, when a French translator named Antoine Galland published his version of 1001 Nights for a European audience hungry for the exotic. The book was a sensation. It was read in candlelit drawing rooms across Paris and London by people who had never been east of Vienna, and the image it planted, the perfumed, languid, sensual Orient, took root with extraordinary speed and extraordinary permanence. Within decades, painters were producing vast canvases of imagined harem interiors. Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres painted his famous Odalisque without ever visiting the Ottoman Empire. The Turkish bath he completed in the early 19th century, that swirling mass of female bodies in a steam room, was built entirely from fantasy. He was painting a dream that Europe wanted to believe, not a place that existed. What made this particularly devastating is what it replaced. Because the actual institution, the Ottoman imperial harem at Topkapi Palace, the Abbasid court in Baghdad, the Mughal zenana in Agra, was not simple. It was not reducible to a single lurid image. It was a functioning governmental structure with its own laws, its own hierarchy, its own economy, its own educational system, its own foreign policy. Calling it a pleasure palace is like calling the Pentagon a dormitory because people sleep there. The stereotype spread because it was useful. Western powers in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries were in competition with Islamic empires for trade routes, for territory, for influence. Depicting the harem as a symbol of Eastern depravity and irrationality served a very specific political purpose. It made the Ottoman Sultan look like a man who spent his days in a fog of sensual excess, while serious European men conducted serious European business. It made Islamic civilization look decadent and irrational. It made conquest feel like rescue. Some historians argue that Orientalist harem imagery was not merely a cultural byproduct of colonialism, but one of its most effective propaganda tools. That the painting of languid odalisques in French salons was doing political work as surely as a military dispatch from the front. That argument is impossible to dismiss when you look at the timing. The peak of Orientalist harem painting coincides almost precisely with the peak of European imperial expansion into North Africa and the Middle East. So let us take that stereotype apart, piece by piece, starting with the one that people assume most confidently, the idea that the women inside were passive, uneducated, and waiting. The women of Topkapi Palace were educated, rigorously, systematically, relentlessly educated. Girls entered the palace school as children, some as young as 5 or 6 years old, and they spent the next decade learning Ottoman Turkish, Quranic recitation, Arabic script, music, poetry, dance, etiquette, mathematics, and the extraordinarily complex protocols of palace diplomacy. Historians who have studied the harem have drawn the comparison to a military academy, not because the conditions were identical, but because the structure was similar. A long, demanding curriculum designed to produce highly capable individuals who would move into positions of influence at the end of their training. The women who survived that system and rose through its ranks were not passive. They were the most politically sophisticated people in the empire, precisely because they had been trained from childhood to be exactly that. There was a rigid, almost monastic hierarchy. At the bottom, the novices, girls just arrived, learning the language, learning the rules, learning where they stood. Above them, various ranks of experienced women with defined duties and specific privileges. Higher still, the Sultan's favorites, each with her own apartment, her own staff of servants, her own income paid by the imperial treasury. And at the very top, 2 women whose power was not ceremonial. The Haseki, the Sultan's chief consort, and above even her, the Valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother, who held authority over the entire apparatus of the harem, and whose political influence extended far beyond its walls into the councils of state. Then there was the economy, and this is where the stereotype collapses most visibly. Every woman in the harem received a salary, not a token allowance, a real income, calibrated to her rank. The highest-ranking women controlled significant personal wealth. They owned property. They funded mosques, hospitals, soup kitchens, caravanserais. Haseki Hurrem Sultan, the woman the West knows as Roxolana, built an entire complex in Jerusalem. It still stands. A woman who supposedly spent her days languishing on a cushion waiting for a man's attention, left permanent architectural marks on 3 continents. And the most persistent stereotype of all, the one Hollywood loves most, is the idea that every woman in the harem was there for the Sultan's pleasure, available to him at any moment. The accounting records of Suleiman the Magnificent's household tell a different story. In the middle of the 16th century, he maintained a harem of roughly 160 women. Historians examining those records estimate that he was intimate with somewhere between 6 and 8 of them. That is a small fraction of the total. The rest were educated, housed, fed, paid, and largely autonomous within their own world. There was also an exit. After 9 years of service, any woman who had never been called to the Sultan's bed was legally entitled to leave the harem with a full dowry, a letter confirming her status as a free person, and a husband arranged by the palace, often a man of considerable rank, because a harem-educated woman was considered among the most accomplished brides available. These marriages were considered honors. The families who received them competed for the privilege. A woman who left the harem this way did not carry shame. She carried credentials. The gap between that reality and the painting on the French salon wall is not a misunderstanding. It is a chasm. And the Ottoman harem, for all its complexity, was not the original model. It was built on a tradition that had been running for 700 years before Suleiman the Magnificent was born, in the courts of Baghdad, in the administrative networks of Abbasid caliphs, in a world where women without official titles were making decisions that moved armies and shaped dynasties. The blueprint was drawn in Baghdad, and the women who drew it left almost nothing to chance. They controlled the grain supply of half the known world before most people in that world knew their names existed. In the 9th century, the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad was the beating heart of human civilization. Its libraries held more books than existed anywhere else on Earth. Its hospitals performed surgeries that Europe would not attempt for another 400 years. Its mathematicians were inventing tools that would not reach the West until the Renaissance. And threaded through all of it, through the appointments of governors, the allocation of military funds, the reception of foreign ambassadors, the delicate management of succession crises that could have torn the empire apart at any moment, were women. Women who held no official titles, women whose names were not recorded in the court chronicles that would later be translated and celebrated, women who operated in the space behind the throne, with a precision that the men sitting on it rarely matched. The most powerful of them was not a caliph's wife. She was his mother. In Islamic court tradition across the medieval period, from Baghdad to Cairo to later Constantinople, the title of Queen Mother carried weight that the Western concept of the same role simply does not capture. In Europe, a Queen Mother was a political liability, someone to be managed, housed comfortably away from the center of power, consulted occasionally, and ignored regularly. In the Abbasid court, the caliph's mother was something closer to a co-regent. She had her own treasury, her own staff of secretaries who handled correspondence, her own network of informants embedded in every layer of the court. She had spent decades in the harem's educational crucible before her son rose to power, and those decades had given her something that no amount of battlefield experience could replicate: an encyclopedic knowledge of every relationship, every debt, every secret, and every ambition in the palace. Historians who have gone back to the primary sources, the administrative records, the private letters, the account books, keep finding the same pattern. A caliph makes a decision. The decision is recorded as his. The correspondence that preceded it, the consultations that shaped it, the careful diplomatic groundwork that made it possible, those trails lead, again and again, to a woman's apartments. Not always the same woman, not a single, all-powerful figure pulling a single lever, a network, an infrastructure of influence that was entirely invisible to the foreign observers who wrote the reports that later historians would rely on, because the foreign observers were never allowed past the outer gate. This is where the record becomes genuinely strange, not because the evidence is absent, but because so much of it survived in places nobody thought to look. The Abbasid court produced a category of document that has no real equivalent in Western medieval records: the internal petition. When a woman of the harem wanted something, a change in her daughter's marriage arrangements, a grant of land for a charitable foundation she was funding, a formal complaint against a court official who had overstepped, she submitted a written petition through the harem's internal administrative structure. Those petitions were reviewed, decisions were returned, and in the archives of what survived the Mongol destruction of Baghdad in the 13th century, fragments of that system have been recovered. They reveal women conducting legal business, managing estates, negotiating contracts, and corresponding with officials across the empire, with a fluency and sophistication that makes the fantasy of the idle, perfumed concubine feel not just wrong, but almost comically wrong, like describing a fighter jet as a kite because both of them fly. There was a girl behind all of this, not a queen, not a famous name, just a girl who entered the Abbasid system at the bottom and learned the rules one by one. Picture her in a corridor in Baghdad in the middle of the 9th century. The city enormous around her, the Tigris River audible from the upper floors of the palace complex, the smell of heated stone and lamp oil, and the particular dusty sweetness of ink drying on papyrus. She is carrying a document from one room to another. She does not fully understand yet what the document means. She understands that getting it to the right person at the right moment matters enormously, and that if she fails, there will be consequences she cannot yet fully calculate. She is learning the system the only way the system allowed, by moving inside it, by watching, by waiting, by becoming indispensable before she became visible. Most of the women who went through that system never had their names recorded. Most of them vanished from the historical record entirely. The ones who made it through, the ones who rose, who survived, who shaped policy and managed succession, they are the tip of an iceberg. The rest of the iceberg is the story that the chronicles chose not to tell. That story was playing out simultaneously across the Islamic world, in courts that were running variations on the same model. Which brings us to a place where every assumption about women, visibility, and power needs to be turned completely upside down. Persia. The standard narrative about women in Persian court culture goes something like this: veiled, sequestered, invisible, kept from public life, defined by the veil as a symbol of suppression. That narrative is taught in Western survey courses. It appears in documentaries. It forms the baseline assumption of most popular writing on the subject. It is also, when you press it against the actual historical record, an almost perfect inversion of the truth. And not just a partial inversion, a structural one. Start with the Achaemenid Empire, the Persian Empire that Darius and Xerxes built, the one that ran from the Aegean coast to the borders of India, the largest empire the ancient world had yet produced. When archaeologists excavated the ancient Persepolis complex in the 20th century, they found something that nobody had predicted: administrative tablets, thousands of them. Clay tablets inscribed in the Elamite language, recording the movements of goods, the payment of rations, the management of royal estates. And running through those tablets with remarkable frequency were the accounts of women. Not servant women, not marginal figures. Women receiving rations calibrated to their rank as estate managers. Women traveling on official royal business with armed escorts paid by the state. Women in charge of production facilities that supplied the palace. One group of tablets describes a woman named Irdabama, who managed an estate of hundreds of workers across multiple sites, and traveled with a retinue large enough to require its own supply chain. She was not the queen. She was not even the most prominent woman in those records. She was simply one node in a female administrative network that the Persian imperial system had normalized to a degree that ancient historians, writing from Greek perspectives shaped by their own very different assumptions about women, had completely failed to notice. The Greek accounts of Persia, Herodotus, Ctesias, Xenophon, are fascinating documents. They are also, on the subject of Persian women, extraordinarily unreliable. The Greeks were projecting their own system onto a civilization that worked by entirely different rules. When a Greek writer described Persian women as confined and powerless, he was describing what he expected to see, because that was roughly the situation of upper-class women in Athens. What the Persian administrative records actually show is something the Greek accounts had no category for: women participating in the economic and managerial life of the empire at every level above the very bottom. There was a specific stereotype embedded in Greek writing about Persia that survived almost intact into the European orientalist tradition 2,000 years later. The idea that a woman behind a curtain was a woman without agency. The Persepolis tablets demolished that stereotype so completely that when the tablets were first published and analyzed in the mid-20th century, scholars spent years arguing about whether the women listed in them were actually women, or whether the titles were being misread, or whether the administrative roles were somehow symbolic rather than functional. They were not misread. The roles were not symbolic. The women were running things. The stereotype had become so embedded that the evidence contradicting it was easier to question than the stereotype itself. This pattern, the stereotype so powerful it makes the contradicting evidence look like the anomaly, is nowhere more visible than in what happened to the Persian model when it was adopted, modified, and sharpened into something even more deliberate under the Safavid Shahs. Shah Abbas I was one of the most capable rulers the Islamic world ever produced. His reign in the late 16th and early 17th centuries transformed Persia. He rebuilt Isfahan from the ground up, restructured the military, reformed the economy, and navigated an almost impossibly complex web of external threats. He was also, by any historical measure, a man who understood power as a system, not a collection of personal relationships, a system. And the harem, in his hands, became one of the system's most deliberately engineered components. The traditional Safavid court had kept the harem as a relatively conventional domestic space. Important, hierarchical, but not radically different from the Ottoman model. Shah Abbas changed that. He dramatically expanded the harem's size, its budget, its internal administrative complexity. The expansion was not about pleasure. The records suggest something far colder and far more calculated. By moving more of the court's political relationships inside the harem's walls, by ensuring that key alliances were cemented through women whose loyalty ran to the harem's hierarchy rather than to external tribal or religious factions, Shah Abbas was solving a specific problem, the problem of treachery from within. The Safavid state had almost collapsed multiple times in the century before Abbas because powerful factions, the Qizilbash tribal leaders who had originally put the dynasty on the throne, kept trying to control the Shah rather than serve him. They had leverage because the Shah's relationships ran through them. Abbas's solution was elegant and brutal in equal measure. He systematically relocated those relationships into a space that the Qizilbash could not enter. He educated harem women in administration, in diplomacy, in the management of regional affairs. He routed correspondence through the harem's internal system. He made the women of his household into a parallel bureaucracy that answered only to him and could not be infiltrated by the factions that had nearly destroyed his predecessors. The stereotype of the harem as a retreat from political complexity was precisely what made this strategy work. Nobody suspects the waiting room of being the operations center. This was not unusual. It was a refinement of a pattern that had been running for centuries across every major Islamic court: Ottoman, Mughal, Mamluk, Abbasid. The pattern was consistent. The harem as a space of enforced loyalty, where the women who entered it owed everything: their education, their status, their safety, their children's futures, to the institution itself, rather than to external power brokers. A concubine who rose to become a sultan's favorite had no tribe behind her, no noble family, no ancient loyalty that could be leveraged against the crown. She had the harem, she had the sultan, and she had the intelligence to navigate that world with the tools the harem itself had given her. In the cold arithmetic of court politics, that made her the most reliable kind of ally a ruler could have. Now here is the thing that changes the shape of the entire story. The harem was not just a passive tool that capable rulers happened to use well. In certain moments, specific, documented, historically verifiable moments, it became an active weapon, deployed with precision against external threats that the official military and diplomatic apparatus could not reach. The Mughal zenana in India ran on the same logic as the Safavid system, but with an added layer of complexity that even the Ottoman and Safavid models did not match. The Mughal court absorbed Hindu, Rajput, and Central Asian traditions simultaneously, and the zenana reflected that collision, a space that was religiously and culturally plural in ways that would have been unimaginable in Constantinople or Isfahan. Akbar the Great, in the late 16th century, maintained a zenana that housed women from virtually every major religious tradition in his empire: Hindu wives, Muslim wives, wives from Rajput clans whose conversion to Islam had never been required and would never be demanded. The zenana was, among other things, a living map of the empire's political alliances, each woman a thread connecting the throne to a different regional power, each thread capable of transmitting information, pressure, loyalty, or betrayal, depending on how the system was managed. His grandmother, Hamida Banu Begum, was one of the most formidable political operators the Mughal dynasty produced. She had survived the catastrophic years when the empire came close to annihilation, had traveled across Persia in exile with the young Humayun, had watched the empire rebuilt from nothing, and by the time her grandson Akbar consolidated his rule, she was the institutional memory of the entire dynasty. Her counsel was not optional, it was structural. She appears in the Mughal chronicles, the Akbarnama, the detailed administrative histories of the court, not as a decorative figure, but as a decision-maker, whose assessments of personnel and loyalty shaped appointments at the highest levels of government. She was not behind the curtain because she was powerless. She was behind it because that was where the real architecture of Mughal rule had always been constructed. That architecture, parallel, female, ruthlessly competent, is what the orientalist painters never put on their canvases, because it would have required something the fantasy could not afford. Acknowledging that the women behind the curtain were not waiting to be rescued. They were running things. They had always been running things. And the men who built the fantasy knew it, which is why they worked so hard to replace the architecture with the image of the cushion and the fountain and the woman who has nothing to do but wait. There is a dimension of this story that even the most sympathetic historical accounts tend to miss, a thread that only becomes visible when you stop reading the chronicles, the official accounts, the diplomatic reports, the carefully maintained record of what the court wanted history to see, and start reading what was filed in the wrong drawer, catalogued under the wrong heading, dismissed as too personal to constitute serious evidence. Because for all the power that some women exercised inside these institutions, the system was also extracting something from all of them. Every woman who rose to influence inside the harem did so by becoming indispensable to a structure she had not chosen to enter. Every act of political brilliance was simultaneously an act of survival inside walls that were not built for her benefit. The question that the official record almost never answers is this: what did the women who did not rise, the ones who spent 9 years learning to pour coffee with perfect ceremony, and then left with their dowries and their letters and their arranged marriages, what did they make of the world they had been inside? What did they say to each other in the long hours when the corridors were quiet and the lessons were done and nobody of rank was watching? What language did they use for what they knew? The answer to that question is not in the Akbarnama. It is not in the Ottoman court chronicles. It is not in the diplomatic dispatches that European representatives sent home to Paris and Vienna and London. The answer is in a different kind of document entirely, one that historians spent a long time dismissing as too personal, too minor, too domestic to be worth serious attention. And when scholars finally started reading those documents seriously, what they found turned the entire story inside out. A letter, written by a woman named Gulbadan Begum in the 1500s, begins not with ceremony, not with the formal honorifics that Mughal court correspondence required, but with something that reads more like a person catching their breath after running. She writes about heat, the particular suffocating heat of a room in Agra in the dry season, when the stone walls hold the temperature of the previous day and the air does not move. She writes about a child who would not sleep. She writes about a disagreement, carefully phrased, the edges sanded down, but still unmistakably a disagreement, with a woman of higher rank whose name she does not use directly, referring to her instead by a title that anyone inside the zenana would have recognized immediately, and that anyone outside it would have found entirely opaque. She writes about a garden she can see from a window but cannot reach. She writes about wanting, very badly, to be somewhere else. Gulbadan Begum was not a minor figure. She was the daughter of Babur, the founder of the Mughal dynasty, and the aunt of Akbar the Great. She wrote the Humayunama, the only first-person chronicle of the early Mughal court written by a woman, one of the only such documents to survive from any Islamic court of the period. For a long time, historians treated it as a charming curiosity, a personal memoir, useful for color, for detail, for the kind of human texture that makes a history book readable, but does not, the thinking went, constitute serious political evidence. That thinking was wrong in a very specific and revealing way. Because embedded in Gulbadan's descriptions of heat and sleepless children and carefully unnamed rivals is something that the official chronicles systematically omitted: the texture of how decisions actually moved through the zenana, not the decisions themselves. Those were recorded elsewhere, attributed to male ministers or to Akbar directly. The texture, the negotiation before the negotiation, the conversation between two senior women that determined which petition would be forwarded and which would be quietly set aside. The informal hierarchy of trust and obligation that the official org chart of the Mughal court never showed. Because the official org chart was maintained by people who had never been inside the room where that hierarchy operated. Her account makes it possible to read the Mughal administrative record differently, not as a distortion, but as an incomplete picture. The view from the outer layer of a system that had several more layers inside. The Humayunama is not a political document in the way the Akbarnama is a political document. Calling it a map to Mughal power structures overstates what it literally contains, but as a guide to where the gaps are in the official record, where the chronicle says a decision was made but does not explain how it was reached, where a name appears without context, where a relationship is referenced but not explained, it is invaluable. It points to the seams, and the seams are where the real structure becomes visible. What the seams reveal about the physical zenana itself is something that architectural historians have found equally disorienting. The Mughal zenana at Agra was not a single building. It was a compound within a compound within a compound. A series of nested enclosures, each with its own gatekeepers, its own rules of passage, its own population, with its own internal hierarchy. The outermost ring was accessible to a relatively wide range of palace staff. The next ring was tighter. The innermost chambers were accessible to almost nobody outside the zenana's own senior women, and the eunuchs who served as intermediaries. That much is standard. The Ottoman harem was organized on similar principles. What Gulbadan's account makes visible, in a way that the official architectural records do not, is what happened in the spaces between the rings. There were corridors in the Agra zenana that led to sealed rooms. Rooms that the official palace inventories listed as storage, grain, textiles, the kind of mundane record-keeping that makes an archivist's eyes glaze over. Rooms that were, in practice, administrative spaces where correspondence was drafted, reviewed, copied, and dispatched through channels that moved in parallel to the official court system, where the senior women of the zenana conducted business that the court chronicles would later attribute to male ministers, because the court chronicles were written by people who had access only to the outer layer of the system and could see the outputs, but not the inputs. Gulbadan does not call these rooms offices. She calls them, in one passage, the places where the serious work happens. Translators have sometimes rendered that phrase as a reference to household management. It is not a reference to household management. The context, a description of a specific dispute over who had authority to respond to a petition from a regional governor, makes clear she is describing something that would be classified, in any modern framework, as administrative and political work. The physical concealment was intentional. A space that looks like it contains grain does not attract the attention of the factions watching for signs of parallel power. A corridor that appears to dead end does not invite exploration. The architecture of the zenana was, in significant part, an architecture of deliberate misdirection, not because the women inside it were hiding from the emperor, but because the emperor's most reliable administrative instrument needed to be invisible to everyone else. Akbar understood this. His great-grandson, Aurangzeb, who ruled nearly a century later and whose reign ended the Mughal Golden Age in a slow collapse driven partly by his systematic dismantling of the political structures his predecessors had built, also understood it, but drew the opposite conclusion. He distrusted the zenana's parallel system. He tightened its restrictions, reduced its administrative autonomy, tried to route its influence through channels he could more directly observe. The zenana's operational capacity did not disappear overnight. It contracted. And as it contracted, the political intelligence it had provided, the early warning system, the network of informal relationships, the management of the 1,000 small crises that never made it into the chronicles because they were resolved before they became crises, contracted with it. Some historians of the late Mughal period have argued, carefully, that Aurangzeb's empire began losing its coherence at precisely the moment he stopped trusting the women who had been running its nervous system. That remains a contested position. It is not an easy one to dismiss. The ambassadors who visited these courts never saw any of this, and the story of what they missed is not just an interesting footnote, it is the key that unlocks why the stereotypes survived so long and traveled so far. European representatives who visited the Mughal, Ottoman, and Safavid courts in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries wrote some of the most detailed accounts of those courts that exist. They were often intelligent men, Some of them were genuinely curious, genuinely attempting to describe what they saw with accuracy, and almost universally, they were producing something that functioned more as a record of their own assumptions than as a record of what was actually happening around them, because the system they were observing had been designed, from the inside, to show visitors exactly what the court wanted them to see. The Venetian diplomatic dispatches from the Ottoman court in the mid-16th century are models of the genre. They describe the Sultan's council meetings, the hierarchy of ministers, the protocols of reception, the management of the treasury, the organization of the military. They convey a confident picture of Ottoman governance as a system centered on the Sultan and his male council. That picture was accurate in the way that a stage set is accurate. The proportions are right. The details are convincing. And if you never go backstage, you have no reason to question it. There is a specific moment in one dispatch, a single paragraph that most historians reading for political content have treated as a minor observation about architecture that becomes, once you know what to look for, almost painful in its inadvertent precision. The ambassador notes that after his formal reception by Suleiman the Magnificent, he was escorted through a particular corridor on his way out of the palace complex, and that the corridor passed close to a section of the building that his escort identified as the private apartments. He observed, he writes, but the latticed windows overlooking the corridor were of unusually fine workmanship. He noted this as an aesthetic detail. He moved on. What he did not know was that those latticed windows were not decorative. They were observational positions. The women behind them were watching the reception that had just concluded. They were evaluating the ambassador, his bearing, his manner, the way he handled the moment of prostration that Ottoman court protocol required, the quality of the gifts he had brought, the confidence or nervousness with which he had presented his credentials. Their assessment would reach the Valide Sultan within the hour. Their assessment would be factored into the Ottoman response to his mission. He left the palace believing he had been received by the Sultan. The full power structure of the Ottoman court had received him, evaluated him, and rendered a judgment, and the half of that structure that he would never be allowed to see had done so through a window he had admired for its craftsmanship. The stereotype of the harem as a space of female passivity is what made that gap possible. An ambassador who believed the women of the harem were idle and politically irrelevant would notice the lattice work and move on. An ambassador who understood what was actually behind it would have sent a very different dispatch home. The stereotype was not just wrong, it was operationally useful to the courts that the ambassadors were trying to read. The orientalist fantasy, in other words, was working in both directions. It served the interests of European imperial ideology abroad, and it served the interests of the courts that the Europeans were trying to penetrate at home. Everyone had a reason to keep the fiction running. Those dispatches went home. They were read, they were filed, they shaped policy and shaped perception, and shaped, eventually, the framework within which the Orientalist painters and novelists and travel writers would later construct their elaborate fictions. The fiction was not built from nothing. It was built from a confident, authoritative, well-intentioned misreading of a system that had been engineered from the inside to produce exactly that misreading in anyone observing from the outside. And here is where the story stops being about the past. The scholars who finally pushed back against all of this, who went into the archives with the explicit intention of reading the documents that had been filed as personal rather than political, domestic rather than administrative, literary rather than historical, faced resistance that had an emotional charge to it. Leslie Peirce, whose work on the Ottoman imperial harem dismantled the pleasure palace myth with rigorous archival precision, found that her framing of harem women as political actors was treated, in certain quarters of the field, as a kind of advocacy rather than scholarship.
Ruby Lal, who reconstructed the Mughal zenana from sources that previous historians had categorized as too minor to matter, encountered the argument that she was reading political significance into documents that were simply personal. Catherine Babayan, whose research on Safavid women uncovered an administrative world that the official court histories had rendered invisible, had her sources questioned in ways that comparable male-authored documents from the same period were not questioned. The resistance was not random. It had a shape, and the shape of it points to exactly what the revised history threatens. Not just the Orientalist fantasy, Not just the pleasure palace stereotype, but something closer and more uncomfortable. The assumption, deeply embedded in how Western historical thinking categorizes evidence, that formal institutions are where real power lives.
That the thing you can document publicly, title officially, and point to in an org chart is the thing that actually governs. That if someone was not in the room where the decision was announced, they were not part of making it. The history of the Harem, read honestly, is a sustained argument against that assumption, running across 1,000 years and half the known world. And that argument is unsettling not because of what it says about medieval Islamic courts, but because of what it implies about every institution that has ever maintained a public face and a private operating system. Every organization that has ever shown the visitor the reception hall while conducting its real business in the room the visitor was not shown. Every structure that has ever used the stereotype of irrelevance as a shield for the exercise of actual power. The women of the harem understood something that the painters, the novelists, the ambassadors, and eventually the historians all underestimated. That being seen and being powerful are not the same thing. That the most durable kind of influence is the kind that does not require a title, does not require a throne, does not require anyone outside the room to know your name. Gulbadan Begum understood it. Hamida Banu Begum understood it. The Valide Sultans of Topkapi understood it. The unnamed women of the Abbasid court, who submitted their petitions and managed their estates, and corresponded with provincial governors across a continent-spanning empire, understood it in their bones, because the system had taught it to them from the moment they arrived. Gulbadan Begum is buried in Agra. Her chronicle survived. The zenana she described was torn down, rebuilt, modified, and finally reduced to the architectural remnants that tourists now walk through, without knowing what the sealed room was for, or why the corridor that appears in the official plans as a dead end turns up in her account as a place of regular, purposeful activity. The stone is still there. The remains of certain windows, with their unusually fine lattice work, are still there. And if you stand in the right place and look through one of them, you can see exactly what was visible from inside. The courtyard, the gate, the space where the ambassadors stood with their gifts and their confident misreading, believing they were the ones being received. They were the ones being watched. Every assumption you carried into this video about who holds power, how they hold it, and what a room full of waiting women actually means, that is the thing that was always on the other side of the lattice. Not a stereotype, not a fantasy, a calculation, running continuously, across centuries, in the places that the official record chose not to name.